Mashudu, good afternoon. You know, in just coming out of that story on the conditions on the ground in Marikana, it would be very interesting to learn what this report has to say. Can you just take us through some of the significant elements of this report?
Afternoon. Yes, absolutely. I think the points that were made by the resident in Marikana is exactly what this report touches on. So this report is specifically looking at where the legal framework and the gaps that are in the current legal framework that doesn't enable communities that are housing mining companies and that are affected by mining development to achieve the benefits or to achieve economic mobility. So mining communities that are housing mining companies, there are various compensation arrangements that they are entitled to. And unfortunately, since the dawn of the new democracy in South Africa, there has been a complete policy failure that doesn't allow for communities to benefit the way in which they're supposed to benefit. And this is for multiple reasons, but the main takeaway that we found from the research is that there's severe corruption that is taking place from key stakeholders. This is from provincial government officials, from traditional leadership, from public officials, as well as mining companies that are involved in creating compensation arrangements that are not designed to benefit communities, but are in fact ones that are lining the pockets of those who are in positions of power.
But what are the recommendations of the report? Because, you know, you can recommend, but if there's no political will from government, the traditional leaders, and even the specialists you're talking about, what is the point? What are the recommendations that the report suggests?
Yes, you know, this report is designed for policymakers, for communities, and for industries to reflect on what best practice can be and look like for financial transparency. Because the reality is the longer that this goes on, the more of a severe impact it will have on not only industry, but on government as well. So when communities do not gain from the mining that is taking place on their land, and there's no avenue, there's no recourse for them, industry risks the risk of losing their social license to operate within the community in which they operate. So when we put the recommendations forward, these recommendations are really about guarding against maladministration and mismanagement and corruption. So things like having oversight, having transparency and accountability provisions and mechanisms within arrangements that industry has with companies. The law is there, but best practice comes from engagement between industry and communities in order to enable a system that works for that particular community.
Well, just lastly, Mashudu, I mean, with the policies being there and your recommendations coming up, how will these be reinforced?
Sure.
And how will this be monitored?
And that's really a good question, and it goes back to what you mentioned earlier, that there is a need for political will. Because, you know, when we're talking about best practice is really, it can be a policy that's put in place that is unique to a particular mining community. But you only get there if you engage, if you speak to the communities that are affected by the mining development. And unfortunately, it seems like our politicians are really going at lightning speed of opposite directions when it comes to what communities want and the policies that they put in place. I think a clear example of where you see that is with the Traditional Khoisan Leadership Act, which enables traditional leaders and chiefs to get into arrangements on behalf of communities, rather than for those that want to get into business deals with communities or that will affect business or communities to engage with the communities directly. So you have a situation where, you know, not only do you need political will, but you need communities' voices to be heard in the policies that they enact.
Are there any recommendations for the communities themselves or any action that they can take to correct the situation?
Well, within communities, you know, a lot of the mineable areas in South Africa are in traditional authorities. So most of the recommendations that are put forward are directed towards transparency and accountability within traditional governance processes. So in traditional communities, you have structures like traditional councils, for example. And currently, the national policy with regards to traditional councils is that there should be 25% of that council should be women, and that 60% of it should be members of the royal family. So our recommendations that we put forward is that while having a 60-40 split is problematic because you need to have an equal number of people who are voted into the traditional council if the traditional council is going to have the powers to get into agreements on behalf of communities.
Well, Mashudu, now that the report is out, what next does Corruption Watch do with the report?
So, you know, fortunately, we've been engaging with the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy regarding this report and regarding really looking at two main pieces of legislation and really elevating them to ensure that there is transparency and accountability. And those pieces of legislation is the Mining Charter as well as the MPRDA. So those pieces of legislation, we've been engaged, we've specifically looked at them, at where the gaps are and where there are areas in which there could be intervention to allow for transparency and accountability. So it's really an ongoing process of engagement. Also, the Mining Charter is currently in this litigation around the Mining Charter, which specifically speaks to issues of engagement with mine-affected communities. So it really is about this report being tabled within the policymakers and seeing that best practice is possible, and where the gaps are to, as much as possible, to mitigate them. When it comes to industry, again, also ongoing conversations with industry based on this report on how they could, beyond compliance of a policy that we consider weak in terms of achieving transparency, to go beyond the legal compliance, but to really develop policy between the operating company as well as communities to enable the financial and economic mobility of mine-affected communities.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. That's the Corruption Watch legal researcher, Mashudu Masutha.